In the heart of the Middle Ages, power wasn't measured in gold, but in castles, armor, and the weapons of war. Knights rode into battle covered in steel, defending kingdoms built behind walls that seemed unbreakable. But no fortress was truly safe. Because with the rise of siege warfare, even the strongest castles could fall. This is the story of the medieval arsenal, of knights, castles, and the deadly machines that changed the fate of empires. Imagine a time long ago, a world without cars, phones, or even electricity. This was the medieval period, often called the Middle Ages. It was a time of kings and queens, lords and ladies, and brave knights. But it was also a very dangerous time. Powerful lords often fought each other for land and control. There were no large, organized police forces to keep the peace. If you were a wealthy lord, you needed a way to protect your family, your people, and your treasures from your enemies. This is why people started building enormous strong homes called castles. These were not just houses. They were mighty fortresses designed to withstand any attack. Castles were the ultimate symbols of power and defense. They stood tall on hills or near rivers, their stone walls reaching for the sky. They were a clear message to any rival: do not attack me, I am safe here. To defend these massive structures, lords needed special soldiers. These soldiers were called knights. A knight was a highly trained warrior, a professional fighter who dedicated his life to combat and service. Becoming a knight was a long and difficult journey, starting as a young boy. They learned to ride horses, use swords, and wear heavy armor. They were the elite fighting force of the medieval world, the defenders of the castle and the king. The whole system was built around protection and control. The king ruled the land, but he gave large areas of it to his most trusted lords. In return, these lords promised to be loyal and to fight for him when needed. The lords then built castles to control their territory and protect the local people who worked the land. These people, known as peasants, would farm the fields and provide food. When danger approached, they could rush inside the castle walls for safety. The castle was the center of life, a safe haven in a very uncertain and often violent world. So the medieval world was a complex web of power, loyalty, and defense. The castle was the strong heart of a lord's domain, and the knight was its armored guardian. Everything we're about to explore, the thick walls, the deadly weapons, the ingenious defenses, was created for one simple reason: survival. People needed to protect what was theirs, and they used incredible skill and creativity to do so. The story of the medieval arsenal is the story of a constant battle between those trying to break in and those determined to keep them out. It's a fascinating tale of engineering, bravery, and strategy. When you picture a knight, you probably imagine a warrior covered from head to toe in shiny metal plates. This is called plate armor, and it was the peak of medieval protection. But this incredible suit didn't appear overnight. The armor of a knight changed a lot over the centuries. In the early Middle Ages, around the 11th century, a knight's main protection was chainmail. This was a long shirt, called a hauberk, made of thousands of tiny, interlinked metal rings. It was flexible and good at stopping a sword cut, but a powerful spear thrust or an arrow could sometimes break the rings or push them into the wound. As weapons became more powerful, armor had to get better. Knights started adding solid metal plates over their chain mail to protect vital areas like their knees, elbows, and chest. By the 15th century, craftsmen had become so skilled that they could create a full suit of articulated plate armor. This armor covered the entire body with cleverly designed joints that allowed the knight to move, walk, and even get on his horse. A full suit of plate armor could weigh over 25 kilograms, so a knight had to be incredibly strong just to wear it and fight effectively for hours. Underneath all that metal, a knight wore special padded clothing. The first layer was a linen shirt and trousers. Over that he wore a thick padded jacket called a gambeson or an arming doublet. This cushion-like layer was crucial. It provided comfort, absorbed the shock from blows, and offered some protection on its own. Imagine being hit by a mace. Even if the metal plate didn't break, the force of the blow could still break your bones. The padded gambeson helped to spread that impact, making the armor much more effective and saving the knight from serious injury. Of course, a knight was not just a walking fortress, he was also a deadly attacker. His main weapon was the longsword, a versatile blade used for both cutting and thrusting. He also carried a dagger for close quarters fighting. For breaking through heavy armor, knights often used powerful weapons like the war hammer or the mace, which could crush helmets and dent plate. On horseback, the knight's most fearsome weapon was the lance. It was a long, wooden spear designed to be charged at an enemy, delivering a devastating impact that could knock another knight right off his horse. A medieval castle was much more than just a big stone house. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Every single feature was designed with one goal in mind: to keep attackers out. The first line of defense was often the location itself. Castles were built on high ground, like a steep hill or a rocky cliff, making it difficult for an enemy army to approach and attack. If there was no natural hill, builders would sometimes create a large man-made mound of earth called a motte. A castle with a good location gave its defenders a huge advantage, allowing them to see their enemies coming from miles away. The next obstacle for any attacker was the moat. This was a deep, wide ditch that surrounded the outer walls of the castle. Moats could be filled with water, making them like a small lake that was very difficult to cross under fire. Even a dry moat was a major problem for attackers. They would have to climb down one side and then up the other, all while archers on the walls above were shooting arrows at them. The only safe way across the moat was the drawbridge, a wooden bridge that could be raised or lowered from inside the castle, effectively sealing the main entrance. The main defense of the castle was its massive stone walls. These were called curtain walls, and they were incredibly thick, sometimes several meters thick at the base. Along the top of the walls were battlements, which had a distinctive up and down pattern. The high parts, called merlons, gave defenders a place to hide while reloading their bows. The low gaps, called crenelles, allowed them to shoot at the enemy below. This design, known as crenellation, is the classic look we associate with castles. It provided the perfect balance of protection and a clear line of sight for firing weapons. To make the walls even stronger, builders added towers at regular intervals. These towers stuck out from the wall, allowing archers inside to shoot along the length of the wall, a technique called flanking fire. This meant there were no blind spots where attackers could hide safely. The main entrance was always the most heavily defended part of the castle. It was protected by a gatehouse, a strong building with one or more heavy iron gates called portcullises. These could be dropped down to trap enemies inside a killing zone where defenders could attack them from above through holes in the ceiling called murder holes. While knights and castles dominated the battlefield, two powerful weapons changed the face of medieval warfare: the longbow and the crossbow. These were ranged weapons, meaning they could strike an enemy from a safe distance. The English longbow was a simple but incredibly effective weapon. It was a tall bow, often as tall as the archer himself, and was usually made from a single piece of yew wood. It was not easy to use. A longbow archer had to be very strong and trained for years to be able to draw the bowstring back to his ear and fire accurately. The power of the longbow was truly terrifying. A skilled archer could shoot up to 12 arrows a minute, creating a deadly storm of projectiles raining down on the enemy. These arrows, tipped with sharp iron points called bodkins, could travel over 200 meters and had enough force to pierce through chainmail and even some types of plate armor. In famous battles like Crécy and Agincourt, English longbowmen defeated much larger French armies of heavily armored knights. The longbow proved that a well-trained peasant with a bow could be just as deadly as a noble knight. The other major ranged weapon was the crossbow. A crossbow looked a bit like a small bow mounted horizontally on a wooden stock. Unlike the longbow, it did not require immense strength to hold it ready to fire. Once the string was pulled back and locked in place, a process called spanning, anyone could aim and shoot it by simply pulling a trigger. This made it much easier to learn how to use a crossbow than a longbow. A soldier could be trained to use a crossbow effectively in a matter of weeks, not years. However, the crossbow had its own disadvantages. Its main weakness was its slow rate of fire. After shooting a single bolt, the soldier had to use a lever or a crank to pull the string back, which could take a long time. A crossbowman might only be able to fire 2 or 3 bolts in the time a longbowman could shoot a dozen arrows. But the crossbow bolt was fired with enormous force. It was shorter and heavier than an arrow and could easily punch through the thickest armor at close range, making it a very feared weapon on the battlefield. When an army arrived at a castle, they couldn't just knock on the door. They had to begin a siege, which was the process of attacking and capturing a fortress. If the castle walls were too strong to climb and the gate was sealed shut, the attackers needed to bring in the heavy machinery. These were the siege engines, giant weapons designed to smash stone walls, hurl massive projectiles, and honestly terrorize the defenders inside. They were the artillery of the Middle Ages, complex machines that required a team of engineers to build and operate right there on the battlefield. One of the most famous early siege engines was the catapult. The word catapult can actually refer to several different types of throwing machines. One common type was the mangonel, which used twisted ropes to create tension. A long wooden arm was pulled back against the tension of the ropes. When released, the arm would fly forward and launch a large stone or other projectile from a bucket at its end. Mangonels were not very accurate, but they could throw heavy rocks over the castle walls, causing damage to buildings and, well, spreading fear among the people sheltering inside. Later in the Middle Ages, an even bigger and more powerful siege engine was developed, the trebuchet. Unlike the mangonel, the trebuchet did not use twisted ropes. Instead, it used a massive counterweight on one end of a long, swinging arm. A team of men would use winches to slowly raise the incredibly heavy counterweight, which would lower the other end of the arm to the ground. Once, a huge projectile, often a stone weighing over 100 kilograms, was loaded into a sling. The counterweight was released. It would drop suddenly, swinging the arm up with immense force and launching the stone with surprising accuracy and power. Trebuchets were the ultimate castle killers. They could be aimed precisely at one section of a castle wall, and they would hurl stone after stone at the exact same spot. Day after day, the constant pounding would weaken the stone, eventually causing the wall to crack and crumble, creating a breach for the attacking soldiers to pour through. Attackers also used trebuchets for psychological warfare. They would launch diseased animal carcasses or even the heads of captured prisoners over the walls to spread disease and break the spirits of the defenders, hoping to force them to surrender. Bringing down a castle was a slow, difficult, and dangerous job. An attacking army had a variety of strategies they could use, often all at once. If the siege engines like the trebuchet were not available or were taking too long to smash a hole in the wall, attackers would try other, more direct methods. One of the most common tools was the battering ram. This was a huge, heavy log, sometimes with a metal head shaped like a ram's head, which is where it gets its name. The log was suspended from a wooden frame with a roof to protect the soldiers holding it. The soldiers would swing the ram back and forth again and again, slamming it into the castle gate or a section of the wall. The repeated heavy impacts were designed to splinter the wooden gate or shake the stones of the wall loose. Of course, the defenders were not just watching this happen. They would drop heavy rocks, pour boiling water or hot sand, and shoot arrows down at the soldiers operating the ram. The protective roof on the ram was essential, but it couldn't always save the men from the determined defense coming from the battlements above. If the walls were too high to climb with simple ladders, attackers would build enormous siege towers. These were tall wooden towers on wheels, often as high as the castle walls themselves. They were covered in wet animal hides to protect them from being set on fire by the defenders' flaming arrows. Inside, soldiers would climb up ladders. Once the tower was pushed up against the castle wall, a drawbridge at the top would be lowered, allowing the attackers to storm directly onto the battlements and fight the defenders hand to hand. Getting the tower to the wall was the most dangerous part of the operation. Another sneaky tactic was to try and go under the walls instead of over or through them. This was called mining or sapping. A group of specialists called sappers would dig a tunnel from the attackers' camp towards the castle. They would dig right up to and then underneath the foundation of a wall or a tower. Once the tunnel was under the wall, they would use wooden props to hold up the tunnel's ceiling. Then they would fill the tunnel with flammable material like dry wood and pig fat, light it on fire and run. The fire would burn away the wooden props, causing the tunnel to collapse and bringing a section of the castle wall crashing down with it. For the people inside a castle, a siege was a terrifying and miserable experience. The moment the enemy army was spotted, the great horn would sound the alarm. The drawbridge would be raised, The portcullis would be slammed down and the gates would be barred. Everyone from the surrounding villages would rush inside the castle walls for protection, bringing their animals and whatever food they could carry. Suddenly, the castle courtyard, normally a busy place of work and trade, would become a crowded, noisy and smelly refugee camp. The greatest fear for everyone inside was simple. How long would the food and water last? A castle's survival depended on its supplies. A well-prepared castle had a deep well to provide fresh water and large storehouses filled with grain, salted meat and wine. But with hundreds of extra people to feed, these supplies could run out quickly. The attacking army knew this. Often their main strategy was not to attack the walls at all, but simply to surround the castle and wait. This was called a blockade. They would cut off all supply lines, preventing any food or help from getting in. This turned the siege into a waiting game, a test of who could endure the longest. Daily life became a struggle for survival. Food would be strictly rationed, and people would grow hungry and weak. Disease could spread quickly in the crowded and unsanitary conditions. Meanwhile, the psychological pressure was immense. The constant threat of attack, the noise of the enemy army outside, and the thunderous crash of trebuchet stones hitting the walls day and night would wear down the defenders' morale. The lord of the castle had to keep spirits high, encouraging his soldiers and promising his people that help was on its way, even if he wasn't sure it was. The defenders were not idle, however. They had to be on guard 24 hours a day. Soldiers patrolled the walls, watching the enemy's every move. Archers stood ready to shoot at anyone who came too close. Repair crews worked tirelessly to fix any damage caused by the siege engines, patching up walls with timber and earth. Women and children played a vital role too, carrying water, tending to the wounded and making new arrows. A siege was a total community effort where every single person had a job to do to ensure the castle did not fall. For centuries, the balance of power between the stone castle and the siege engine remained relatively stable. Attackers developed better trebuchets, and defenders built thicker, rounder walls to deflect the stones. This back and forth of military technology defined the Middle Ages. But a new invention from China was slowly making its way to Europe, an invention that would change warfare forever: gunpowder. At first, it was used in small, unreliable handguns, but soon, military engineers realized its true potential was in creating a new kind of siege weapon: the cannon. Early cannons were clumsy and dangerous. They were made from iron bars bound together with hoops, and they were just as likely to explode and kill their own crew as they were to hit the target. But technology improved rapidly. Founders learned how to cast massive cannons from bronze or iron in a single piece. These cannons could fire heavy iron or stone cannonballs with a force that no trebuchet could ever match. The age of the giant throwing machine was over. The age of gunpowder artillery had begun, and the mighty stone castle was suddenly in very big trouble. A traditional high vertical castle wall, which was perfect for defending against ladders and siege towers, was the worst possible design to face a cannon. A cannonball hitting the flat surface would transfer all of its energy, shattering the stone and blasting a hole in the wall. The high towers that gave archers such a great view now just made them an easy target for cannon fire. A siege that might have taken months with a trebuchet could now be over in a matter of days. The cannon made the classic medieval castle obsolete. It could no longer guarantee safety for the lord inside. In response, military architecture had to change completely. New fortresses were built lower to the ground to present a smaller target. Their walls were made even thicker and were angled outwards in a star shape, known as a star fort. These angled walls, or bastions, were designed to deflect cannonballs rather than absorb their full impact. The age of the tall, romantic castle was ending. The era of low, powerful artillery forts had arrived. Gunpowder didn't just end the dominance of the castle, it also made the knight in shining plate armor less effective, as early firearms could pierce even the best armor. The entire medieval system of warfare was crumbling. The weapons and fortifications of the Middle Ages may seem ancient to us now, but their impact on history is enormous. The medieval arsenal, the combination of knights, castles, and siege warfare, shaped the political and social landscape of Europe for hundreds of years. Castles were not just military bases, they were the centers of government, justice, and economy for their local regions. They allowed kings and lords to project their power, control land, and establish the kingdoms that would eventually become the nations we know today. The map of modern Europe was drawn around these centers of power. The constant arms race between attack and defense spurred incredible innovation. The need to break into castles led to the development of complex machines like the trebuchet, which required a deep understanding of physics and engineering. The need to defend against these machines led to breakthroughs in architecture and construction. This relentless cycle of problem and solution pushed medieval technology forward. The skills learned by the engineers, stonemasons, and blacksmiths of the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for the scientific and industrial revolutions that would follow centuries later. Even though castles are no longer used for war, they continue to capture our imagination. They stand today as powerful monuments to a very different time. They are a physical link to our past, allowing us to walk the same battlements where archers once stood and look out from the same towers where watchmen once scanned the horizon for enemies. They fuel our stories, movies and games, providing the perfect setting for tales of heroism, adventure and conflict. The knight in shining armor remains a potent symbol of chivalry and bravery, while the castle itself symbolizes strength and endurance. Finally, the medieval arsenal teaches us a fundamental lesson about history. Technology drives change. The introduction of the longbow challenged the dominance of the knight. The invention of the cannon made the mighty castle vulnerable. Each new weapon or defensive strategy forced societies to adapt, changing not just how they fought wars, but how they were governed and how they lived. The story of the medieval arsenal is a dramatic reminder that the struggle for power and survival is a powerful engine for human ingenuity, leaving a legacy written in stone and steel that we can still see and explore today.